warm welcome to everyone. Beyond the science, the missing piece in climate action. How would you describe the urgency of the climate crisis globally and in the South Asia? How bad is it? How worried should we be?
It's about a life and death situation. It's like we are pushing the car towards a cliff. And if we pass the peak, unfortunately, we don't have a control. And the urgency is that we are reaching to that peak in terms of climate change.
What would you be concerned?
So we see inconsistency in policy, and this is why we are not able to somehow jump off that wheel of vulnerability. So climate change communication is actually an art and a science. We have to know the audience.
Are we achieving behavioral change? What is your aspect on it?
If somebody is not getting food, if somebody is, their whole focus is on reaching their offices on time, climate is not their, problem. South Asia, one of the most poorest part of the world, but it is also the most disconnected part of the world.
Are we communicating correctly? Are we communicating effectively? What are we communicating? What are we putting out as a message to?
Will change your behavior based on your understanding. Communication needs to be kind of a multidimensional. So not only the scientific information, it needs to be mixed with your culture. It needs to be come from a kind of a trustworthy sources. We also have a counterattacks against climate change as well. We should not forget about it.
Yeah.
We have seen at the very highest level of global policy making, the climate change has been challenged.
So the answer may not lie about what we know at the moment, but it's how we communicate and what we know. And more importantly, it's also about how we connect that knowledge to people's lives, to people we know, their emotions, and to everyday decisions that they're making. Very warm welcome to everyone to the webinar, which we talk about Beyond Science, Beyond the Science, the missing piece in climate action, which is organized by the Climate Change Communication Hub in Sri Lanka. My name is Sharon Mascarenhas, and I'm delighted to join you as your moderator from Australia. And we live in a world where climate action is no longer a choice, but an urgent necessity. And the impacts are visible, the warnings are loud, and we also see so many solutions within our reach itself. And the science has given us evidence, and the policy interventions are always in motion. However, despite the decades of research and reports and people's working hard on this, the negotiations and the collective response that we bring forward to the table, it always falls short, and there's always a big question mark. And we have this point that reaches out saying, why is this happening? Where is the disconnect between knowledge and action? And what are we actually missing? So the answer may not lie about what we know at the moment, but it's how we communicate and what we know. And more importantly, it's also about how we connect that knowledge to people's lives, to the people we know, their emotions, and to everyday decisions that they're making. And for the stakeholders who actually matter, we're talking of the academics, the policymakers, the influencers who are working really hard, and people who are actually joining us on our webinar who are passionate about these topics as well. So this conversation is about understanding the importance of climate communication and exploring those opportunities and challenges and making more meaningful for every stakeholder, turning it into a true catalyst for a real world action. So today we're joined by three incredible thought leaders from across South Asia who will help us unpack this communication gap and share with us regional insights and inspire new approaches to climate storytelling, and that goes beyond the graphs and policy straight to human heart. Now, before we go or dive into the panel discussion, I'd like to take a minute to invite the co-founder of the event, the webinar that we are organizing here today, the co-founder of Climate Change Communication Hub, Mr. Samantha Nayakaratne, to deliver the welcome remarks. Mr. Samantha?
Welcome to the Beyond Science, the Missing Piece in Climate Action, the webinar organized by the Climate Change Communication Hub. Our vision at Climate Change Communication Hub is simple yet powerful to transform how we talk about the climate change. Our mission is to build bridges between knowledge and action, science and society, researchers and practitioners, academic and the corporate sector, and the policymakers and general public. Because the meaningful collaboration is key to lasting climate solutions. We already have ample evidence, the innovation, and the proof that climate change is real and it's here. But what we don't see enough of is people adopting it. We don't see the behavioral shift that climate action they desperately need. Why? The question why? Because we believe the missing piece is communication. And this is not just about the mass media campaigns or the public messaging. It is about rethinking how we communicate at every level, from the way we gather information, the discussions, and to how to conduct the workshops, to how we engage stakeholders and educate communities. It is about every climate conversations more inclusive, the action-oriented, and the impactful. So that is why the Climate Change Communication Hub exists, to fulfill this gap. And my dear friend and the co-founder of our organization always says, the world needs artistic scientists and scientific artists. The only then the knowledge and the action truly move forward together. Thank you for being a part of this conversation and this journey. Sharon, over to you.
Thank you, Samantha. Thank you very much. And we appreciate you sharing your thoughts and the importance of why we are going ahead as well. All right, no need to waste time. Let's move on. So to officially begin, we'd like to take you through a quick synopsis as to what we are hoping to achieve through this session. We want to see or demystify climate change at its everyday impact, identify the communication gap that hinders climate change messages, which is more inclusive, understand the behavioral changes, and we also want to foster dialogue and collaboration among diverse stakeholders to create an impactful climate communication strategies. That's our objective as to why we're having this webinar today. So allow me to introduce you to our panelists who are joining us from different parts of the Indian Ocean, as I would put it. Joining us from Sri Lanka is a visionary leader in climate policy and sustainable development with over a decade of experience advising governments in Asia Pacific and the Caribbean. His expertise includes climate finance, circular economy integration, and he has also facilitated leadership programs for senior professionals across sectors. We're very honored to have with us the climate change policy expert, EU Switch Asia program based in Thailand, Mr. Ranga Palivala, joining us from Sri Lanka. Hi, Ranga. Good evening.
Hi, good evening. Thanks for having me here.
Good to have you on board. And next, we are joined by a pioneering journalist and an environmental advocate with over 40 years in media and development, and she's a member of the Pakistan's National Climate Change Council and has played a central role in marine conservation. And she's also Pakistan's first female cricket journalist and a strong voice for responsible media and climate justice. Joining us from the advisory board member of Freedom Gate Prosperity is Miss Afia Salam from Pakistan. Good evening, Afia.
Thank you. Thank you. Delighted and honored to be here.
We would love to talk about cricket, but we can have that on a separate topic.
Sure thing, definitely.
Next, joining us as our panelist is a pursuing a PhD in international climate cooperation and a legal frameworks for technology transfer. Her work spans academia, NGOs, and government agencies, and she has published widely on topics including human rights, international law, and climate change policy. Doctoral candidate, Faculty of Legal Studies, South Asian University, joining us. Good to work with her again, Apurva Pathak from India.
Thank you, Sharon. And I'm so glad to be here and, to have this conversation. I'm so excited.
All right, let's dive in by trying to set the context for today's topic, which is beyond the science, the missing piece in climate action. And I would like to start by asking Ranga, how would you describe the urgency of the climate crisis globally and in the South Asia? How bad is it? How worried should we be? We hear examples, we read the news every other day of conditions being taking place, but where do we stand, Ranga? And even the place where you are can be quite nerve-wracking.
Thank you so much. I'll try to bring an analogy because it's all about communication. I'm trying to, simplify my scientific language to everybody. Imagine you have a breakdown car and you need to push it to a kind of a cliff, and you're pushing the car to a mountain. And after a certain point, imagine that's the kind of a steep. And once you reach to the peak, and if you pass the peak, you don't have the control of the car because it's just steep and the car will move by itself, probably a little faster, and be devastating if you don't have the control of the car after the cliff, after the peak. So I think it's same as the climate. Of course, we have a climate which controls everything around us, the predictability, the sun, and the all the living factors of living beings and the interactions with the world is controlled by climate, whether we like it or not. And we are changing the climate. Of course, the climate is naturally changing. It's an evolutionary process, but we have seen it's happening beyond the traditional or the evolutionary process. There's a man-made or human-made climate change is happening. Human-induced climate change is happening because for the sake of the development, we are changing the composition of the atmosphere and the interaction of atmosphere with all the other the spheres, with the earth, with the plants, with the animals, and with the physical the environment. And with this changing, of course, it can create irreversible damage, and we need to make sure that we are controlling the climate and we are bringing it back, or we are curtailing the negative impacts of climate change, so that it doesn't create irreversible impacts. But unfortunately, we couldn't, turn back from the devastating path of development. We are keep on changing the atmospheric composition and its impact. The implication is basically with the greenhouse gases, in terms of the fossil fuel consumption, in terms of the damaging to the what you call the carbon sinks. It includes forests, and it includes plants, it includes the coral reefs, whatnot. And we are devastating those. So as a cumulative effect, we are increasing the greenhouse gases, and it creates so many impacts. It can go into creating extreme weather events, plus affecting on our social and economic lives too. So it's like we are pushing the car towards a cliff. And if we pass the peak, unfortunately, we don't have a control. And the urgency is that we are reaching to that peak in terms of climate change. After a certain point, we don't have control, and it creates like uncontrollable, devastating impacts to the entire world. It's about a life and death situation, not only for the humanity, but for the entire life on this planet. So the urgency is that reversing back the process or the climate, we can't do it in just 1 year or 2 years or 10 years. It needs a long time. So the urgency is that we are now having a very narrow space to maneuver. We are keep on narrowing the controllable space, and we need to do something within that controllable space. That's why this urgency is. And if we pass this point, probably during this century, we might not be able to reverse this. This is how urgent it is. And scientists have been warning about this since 1992, since the IPCC first assessment report to the world. and the scientific evidence is there. But unfortunately, the entire humanity, including you and me, have not been able to reverse our path of development based on those warnings. So now we are almost like 35 years after the scientists' first warning about the climate change. We haven't done enough. And the space we have, the time we have is not 35 years. We have very limited time to change our development narrative, development pathways, to make sure that the planet is a livable place and a lovable place. So this is how urgent it is. So there's no tomorrow. We need to do it now. This is how urgent it is. And I'm trying to simplify it without giving any scientific words. I'll stop there. Probably we can move into the discussions later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Ranga. I think couldn't have found a better example than to explain it through very simple terms as to how our day-to-day lives roll in and the precautionary measures as to where we stand at the moment. Afia, just to understand, what are the most pressing impacts that we're already seeing in our region based on life, based on food, health, ecosystems? I know there is war happening around the world. That's a separate topic on the other side. But what would you be concerned?
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. And, Ranga has set the context very, very well. He's laid it out why it is so important, why it is so urgent. And that is the crux of climate change communication, which is beyond the science. Because earlier, maybe a couple of decade and a half ago, science also was being called into question. But now the science is settled. This is happening. And not only that, the peak he's talking about, there were so many tipping points and we kept crossing them despite the conversation that was being had. And we are into this species extinction. We are into a triple planetary crisis. Now these are terms, these are jargons which people in the climate change fraternity all are familiar with. So what we need to realize is that how are we going to present this to people who are going to be the decision makers, who need to, is that push comes to shove kind of a question, that who is going to take the redressal actions, and the impacts that you're talking about. Now that term itself is global south. So all the countries we are representing here right now in this webinar fall within the global south. This is decidedly the more vulnerable area, the area that has not really contributed as much to the to climate change as it is actually being impacted. Then this is an area where almost a quarter of the humanity on the face of the earth lives. And it doesn't really, and a large part of it doesn't live a very, very good life. Right. So we are actually battling with several things at the same time. We are battling with our development imperatives. We are, we need to take people out of poverty, which is such a dehumanizing effect. And because that is something, again, that's the climate change communication gap. We do not attribute the resource degradation, the environmental degradation, to the footprint of the population on natural resources. What else can they have? They do not have access to what the global north has, the facilities, the coping mechanisms. So this is what is happening, and this is why, I know you earlier gave the example of art and science. So climate change communication is actually an art and a science. We have to know the audience. And in this, when I was talking about the decision makers keep changing. You have the politicians, you have the rulers, you have the policy makers, you have the bureaucracy in our countries. And how much do they understand about what the climate change fraternity has been actually shouting from the top of the roofs now for quite a few years? So we see inconsistency in policy, and this is why we are not able to somehow jump off that wheel of vulnerability. And this is what we need to check, because yes, behavior change communication is important for people on a mass level, because they need to sort of safeguard themselves from the impacts of climate change. But then those who need to take decisions of how they're going to pull them away from disaster, which is fallout of climate change, do they understand it? Do they know what we are talking about? And how can actions by them trigger that kind of behavior change where our lives can, be a little less vulnerable to climate change, to which we have not really contributed a lot, not as much as many other countries. I'll stop here. I'm sure the conversation will move forward.
Absolutely. And different highlights, which is important. I'm sure all of our panelists today will be bringing us different insights as to how it is and how is trying or doing their level. But we have a little bit of an issue of how do we roll it out. But let me throw this question to the both and Afia. From perspective, how prepared are the South Asian countries? It's always the case where we see ourselves happen. Now, what do we do next? It's always the case like that. And sometimes there could be organizations pressuring, this is going to happen. Why aren't you waking up? I would like perspectives as to how ready. Ranga?
Yeah, I think it's a kind of a yes and no answer. I'm comparing about 20 years back and how we are now. Of course, the South Asian countries have done a lot to face the situation and preparing themselves to the negative impacts of climate change, as well as how to tackle the climate change aspects. But unfortunately, what has happened is the changes that we have done on the preparedness of the countries is not in par of the mounting challenges, because the climate change challenges are not static. Of course, it's increasing, and it's increasing in an exponential manner. But unfortunately, our capacity creation, the readiness of the entire country, not from only from the policy perspective, but from the capacity perspective and the changing of institutions, changing of people's mindset, everything needs to happen, because climate change is not just an environmental issue now. It's going across the sectors. It's going into the environment, the social, and the economic, all three pillars into all the sectors. You name any kind of a sector or any kind of a profession in the world, and there is a kind of a link to climate change. So everybody needs to prepare for this. And therefore, all the sectors should know and acquire knowledge about this, and especially the institutional and the policy landscapes. Now, for example, most of the South Asian countries, if you look at the basic governance structures, those governance structures have been established and they designed and constructed for the situation that was ready for about last 50 years or so. But the climate change is quite a new challenge, which is evolving and increasing, and it's intensifying. But our governance structures are still the same. So the current governance structures, I do believe, which is not sufficient to face the climate change challenges. I'm giving just an example. So we are, of course, ready. We are doing a lot of things, but unfortunately, those are well below par of the requirements. So we need to do more. So I'll stop there, but that's my general answer.
Yeah, I would actually agree, because you see, it's and the currency, the word that is gaining currency now when we are talking about climate change and its communication, is intersectionality. It's a health issue, it's an education issue, it is a livelihood issue, it is a housing issue. What kind of houses will withstand the kind of disasters that are there? Because and do we have the capacity within the academia, within the policy makers, and do we have the financial wherewithal and technical wherewithal to be able to keep pace with the changes? Because absolutely, it's not static. We deliberate, we have these roundtables, we have policy discussions, we have research reports, etc., etc., and climate has actually leapfrogged into another crisis. So whatever we have learned and we had decided to put in place, it's redundant generally, or very little of it remains relevant. So that is the challenge, that we have to keep pace. And for that, if I speak in Pakistan's context, in the German Watch list of vulnerable countries, Pakistan now is number one. We have been within the top 10, in the top 10 bracket for over a decade and a half. But if you look at it, and if in hindsight, we would be preaching to the choir. It was a climate change fraternity which was talking to each other, at each other, calling people out and saying, this is happening, that's happening. But overall, within society, within academia, within the bureaucracy, or within the, all the other sectors, the threat perception was not commensurate. It still is not commensurate with the kind of threat that we are facing, being the most vulnerable country in the world. So this is the challenge, that what kind of communication. And yes, you very kindly, you introduced me as a journalist of long standing. What we actually need to know is that communications is about first identifying your audience, and then actually breaking those silos even within communication, because even until very recently, communication was thought of as maybe journalism is communication, and maybe the climate change organizations, they will have some advocacy, they have an advocacy unit, they will produce literature, they will hold seminars, they will have, and then of course the activists jumped in, because they realized, and especially, I would give a lot of credit to the younger generation, that they actually wrested the initiative from a very slow moving response that they were watching, and they could see the urgency. They could realize, because they knew that they are going to be left bearing that burden of all the inaction, or rather the sins of omission and commission. And that kind of activism, I would say, has proven to be more of an effective form of communication, because that broke the barriers. It's a younger generation, they've got new tools, they are connected. So it's not a country specific issue that they talk about. They speak about global issues, they speak about regional issues. Right now we are here talking, of a certain region over South Asia. I'm part of those forums where South Asians are actually speaking to each other. And, this is where those political boundaries don't really matter, because they know that the climate change and environment do not respect any boundaries. They know that we have to collaborate. We have similar problems, and we have to look for shared solutions for those similar problems. And the conversation is happening, but it hasn't broken those barriers beyond this fraternity. And that is what we need to make people understand. And if you will allow me a little bit of digression, because you said we'll have this conversation some other time on cricket. But recently, too, a very interesting article, and if you'll allow me, I can put it in the chat, the link to it, has actually linked both these things. The first article came around 6 years ago, and kudos to those journalists and those researchers who tracked this. And recently, the big tournament, the IPL, it was all sort of disrupted because of the changing climate. And this is something which when I was teaching at university, I would take it is everybody's business. It is not a climate scientist business or a climate environmental law thing. It is impacting each and every sector, even sports, because generally when you say sports, people think, oh, that's something so frivolous. It's not. It is especially in our South Asia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka. It's a cricket fanatic piece of region, and it impacts the lives and livelihoods of and an industry to the tune of billions of dollars. So once people start thinking in the lines of what's in it for me, I need to look for those solutions. Even if on a very selfish level they start looking at solutions, they will have started to develop an understanding of how big this issue is. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Afia, for bringing us those examples. Apurva, you probably research the most in your context of work and stuff. Tell me, how do you see this?
See, already Afia ma'am and Ranga sir has already shed light on the fact that climate change is not just one particular topic, but it's an intersection of various sectors and fields. I would say I think everything connects with climate change. Okay, so if you are talking about, say, South Asia, I mean, all the South Asian countries, we are global South countries, right? And so development is the number one agenda for all the countries. Now, the clash between environment and development has always been the topic, has always been something that has to be balanced by these states. So the policies always have to take into consideration these things. Now, impact of climate change has already been said. It impacts the human rights, the realization of human rights, that is with respect to the health, with respect to education, right, with respect to livelihood. Everything is impacted because of climate change. So we see, the change in temperature. We see it's affecting the health. There are more and more diseases happening because of the glacier melting, because of the rise of the sea level. I mean, the respiratory diseases and so many. I mean, diarrhea and whatnot because of the floods and everything. So, I mean, and it is affecting the livelihood. We know that agriculture is the main occupation of all the South Asian countries, right? And agriculture is hugely impacted because of climate change. So education, of course, I mean, human rights, we know a right to education is a very, very big, right to education is a very big human right. That is also impacted because of floods. A lot of schools, I mean, are shut down and students are not, I mean, even now we see in India, there are various areas of northeast, of south, which are facing floods currently, and a lot of schools have shut down, and I mean, it's affecting their right to education. So we see that all the human rights are also impacted. The development is also impacted. So I mean, the urgency to take to communicate the actions which needs to be taken with regard to climate change, it just cannot be overstated. I mean, it's now we are saying that it's a current issue. Actually, climate change has been discussed at international level 30 years ago, more than 30 years ago. So if we talk about international framework or international mechanisms to deal with climate change has been introduced in 1992 under United Nations. So United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change came in 1992, and under that we had Kyoto Protocol, which came in 97 and which came into force in 2005, and the latest international climate treaty, that is the Paris Agreement, it came in 2015. And all these issues that has been talked by the previous speakers with regard to how it affects the different strata of the population, the poverty being one of the issues. So that is taken into consideration under these treaties. So like Kafia ma'am said that the South Asian countries are the countries of global South who have contributed least to the problem of climate change. So that means least to the carbon emission. Now currently, if we see, India is among the top carbon emitters. But if you see the overall carbon emissions of all the countries, we are still countries who have contributed least to it. Now, if we talk about, say, Bhutan, Nepal, Bhutan is carbon neutral country. It has 70% forest cover. It is not emitting carbon. Nepal also, on the other hand, these are, I mean, the carbon emissions of these countries are very less. Sri Lanka also, Maldives also. Bangladesh, India, yes. And in India, I mean, now it has increased its carbon emissions. So even at the international platform, the arguments of these countries have been that we are developing countries. Therefore, we are allowed to emit carbon. Therefore, the obligations, international obligations with regard to mitigation has to be reduced for developing countries, including even China. So India, China, all these countries, G77 countries, they have always put forward this argument. But the problem is, everybody is emitting carbon, and it is small island countries, it is those coastal areas, people who are affected by it. So even if India says or China says that it's our right to emit this thing because we are developing countries, developed countries have already reached a level of development, and therefore they are responsible for taking mitigative actions towards carbon emissions. But it does not matter. I mean, if you are emitting carbons, you are increasing the temperature, and the impact is going to happen. You cannot stop it. So there has to be a collective action taken by the whole world, which is going to address this issue. It's not that a group of countries or small countries of just Nepal, Bhutan, Sri Lanka saying that okay, we are taking, no, collectively it has to be done. And in the context of South Asia, like Afia ma'am has already stated, it is one of the most poorest part of the world. It is also one of the most populous part of the world, right? So therefore, I mean, you cannot do away with your developmental aspirations. You have to take that into consideration. You have to address your poverty. At the same time, you have to adapt for the climate change that is already happening, right? And it has to be done collectively. So South Asia not only is the most populous and the poor, one of the most poorest part of the world, but it is also the most disconnected part of the world. You see, every region of the world has very good regional organizations which are addressing these issues. Like for example, ASEAN, how it deals with the climate change. I mean, we can always learn from that. Even African countries, even Middle Eastern countries, but South Asia is the most disconnected part of the world. So we have SARC, the regional organization for South Asian countries, but we all know it's, I mean, almost lying defunct. And SARC has taken good initiatives with regard to climate change. They had headquarters in Gurgaon with regard to communication of all these weather updates and all that. But and then there were other policies also which were undertaken under SARC. But then SARC is not functioning, and there is, I mean, because of, we know, the mutual distrust between the countries, that communication is lacking. And for climate change, you need that collaborative action. And that is, in the context of South Asia, is really missing. I would like to stop here and then.
Well, it's Apurva, we could have gone on and on, isn't it? Which leads
Yeah.
to a follow-up question in, are we communicating correctly? Are we communicating effectively? What are we communicating? What are we putting out as a message to the people? Because we stress people saying we need to deliver this message. And then my question here is, how do we focus on a communication? Because that's the whole theme of today's topic, communicating on climate right. And then we see a lot of scientific innovation, the policy changes, we see a lot of them doing a lot, but are we communicating enough? Ranga, what do you think?
Thanks. If I said if you look at the objective of communication is that you need to understand what others say, and you will change your behavior based on your understanding, right? That's the objective of communication, right? So if you see how people change their behavior, communication needs to be kind of a multidimensional, right? We know how the communication or the scientific evidences and scientific informations are being disseminated about how bad alcohol and how bad smoking is, and we see how many smokers and how many people are there consuming alcohol in the world, right? Because communication, I would say, it's a kind of a wholehearted thing. It's not only the scientific information, it need to be mixed with your culture. It need to be come from a kind of a trustworthy sources, and it need to come from the people and the sources where you will keep your eyes, ears, and the entire mind open for that communication, etc. I think this is common to everything, and I think in climate change also this is not happening. What we are lacking is that we are lacking of people who are championing in particular areas, particular aspects to bringing this. How important is that for that particular sector? I'll give an example. For the health sector to understand the impact of climate change, it required about a bunch of health experts, including doctors, who are talking about climate change. It was very difficult for us to find that first 100 doctors around the world. Even within WHO, that was the happening. That was the reason. And the cricket, Afia Saab mentioned about that. I think it's quite important, because that the people who talk about cricket, in that language, how climate change is important for cricket is important. And I have seen very recently some of the aviation experts coming and saying how climate change important is for aviation, saying that the air turbulences is going to be tripled in the next 10 years because of climate change. That particular message coming from the aviation experts, not from the climate change. And the entire sector is agitated and said, okay, this is something that we need to discuss. So there's a kind of a snowball effect in communication. And creating that first snowball rolling is quite important. And we need to understand to find that snowballs in all the sectors are quite important. I think this is where we are. I can't say lacking. I have seen people are suggesting and struggling to create these snowballs in different places, but it's happening in a slow phase. And on the other hand, because of the seriousness, we also have a counterattacks against climate change as well. We should not forget about it.
Yeah.
We have seen at the very highest level of global policy making, the climate change, the concept of climate change has been challenged. The concept of the basic science has been challenged based on the political stances. So how to counterattack these misconceptions of the communication is also important. So what we have seen is, number one, we need to have more snowballs, and we need to roll these snowballs very fast and quickly from different directions. And at the same time, there are barriers for this snowball rolling, and we need to think of how communication can remove these barriers. Those are quite important. And there's a struggle, but of course there are opportunities as well. I think we are a little slow in capitalizing those opportunities, and we are very much, I would say, siloed. We are divisive in terms of our messaging, but we need to have a common voice, and we need to have, I would say, sector leaders, those who will communicate messages among the different sectors.
Since we are going on with the no ball policy, I'd like to ask Afia, in terms of fielding, are we effectively fielding the whole point of climate change? How do we effectively deliver the message? How do we do that?
Okay, from what Ranga has said, and if I am the one who's supposed to champion the cricketing lingo, let me say that what he is saying is that in an age of T20, we are playing test matches. Our response is slow, our understanding is sort of very leisurely paced out. Even cricket has lost the audience for test matches, right? Because everything is very fast paced. And everything goes together, because the kind of tools we have, our attention spans are also of the newer generation, are very, very compressed. So we are living in a new era. And in this era, we have to first, of course, identify our audience. And this means, obviously, we do sit at policy tables. But there is the younger generation. I'll go back to what I said about the activist fraternity. They have actually made them listen. Apurva was so correct. We are going into COP30. That means for 30 years, we've been discussing this. But it only happened just prior, I think Copenhagen, which was 15, is when the interest in a broader fraternity, whom we saw, the people on the street, it spilled over there. And if you can see how the conversation has changed, or rather the terms have changed, it was climate change, right? Then it became a climate crisis. Then it has become climate injustice. So the whole outlook changes when you look at it with a lens of justice and injustice. And that is what I feel, that the noise that was being made, I've been to a couple of COPs, and the noise that was being made as you enter the COP by the activists and the protesters was actually having the kind of effect that drove the policymakers to some kind of decisions. Again, they are very, very taking very long. Like, I mean, if I give the example of loss and damage, the late Dr. Salimul Haq from Bangladesh, IIED, huge name. He had introduced the concept of loss and damage prior to the COPs. So that means, even I met him 1 year, just before he passed at COP28. And he said, I've been talking about it for 30 years. But it was the noise that was being made outside in the lobby by the people who are feeling the brunt of injustices uh, uh, of climate, the way climate crisis is being handled. That in COP28, the words loss and damage entered the text of the final text. And now we are in 2025. So the committees have been formed, and who will get it, how much will it, we are still at that stage. And if you see the crisis, you in your opening statement had mentioned, there are wildfires, there are floods. Apurva talked about the northern part of India. Our northern part is bearing the same kind of devastation. So all these things are happening at a much faster rate. And this is why we have to pivot ourselves to those different audiences who can bear pressure on the people who sit in these big decision making rooms, and make them realize that it goes beyond the fine jargon, that is contained within those reports. And it is about the person in the street who is being impacted, and who is not willing to for you to take these so much of time in coming to terms with things and making things better for them. So this is also, then again, because I've been a journalist, I train journalists, I've also taught at a couple of universities. So we need to break that, and I've been giving examples, and I think India does a very good job of it. Or maybe because I know, because we understand the language the people across the border also speak, of picking up issues and handling them in a way that resonates. Plastic pollution, like Ranga said, you have to have champions within each sector. They got, because India follows Bollywood, they have these celebrity singers. They had a whole song made about plastic pollution, which I showed my class. And the concept is so simple, but for them, it must have been such a logistically large endeavor to get all the top singers of India, everybody who had everybody's eyeball, on that one platform for a 1.5 minute song, which was so effective. I had gone on a training to Korea, and that was for marine protected areas. And over there, they were showing us their examples. We, at least my generation, we sort of are dismissive of what the influencers or vloggers do, because we feel it's very, sort of frivolous. But they had the vloggers go to the area of their marine protected areas and talk about it to their followers. And these followers transcend boundaries, age groups. Maybe they don't penetrate us, but they do penetrate a large number of the people who are going to inherit this earth. And they are not the ones who are looking at people like us talking about it in seminars or webinars, or in at other places. They are accessing content, and if the person they are following is saying something, they follow, they understand. So yes, we need champions in cricket. We need cricketers and cricket managers to talk about this now, especially because, like I said, what's in it for me? How is it going to harm me? Sometimes it's not just, out of the goodness of your heart, people do something good. They stop doing the harm because it's harming them as well. Like we tell our industry that if you're polluting the sea, it is not only impacting the fisher folk community. That fish is going to be served at your table. And that polluted fish, which has organic as well as heavy metals, and of course nanoplastics and microplastics, you are ingesting it too. So you clean up your act. You have to clean up your processes. So it is everybody's business, and that's my thrust these days is to talk about intersectionality, and it is everybody's. Until and unless the Lancet journal hadn't mentioned about the impact of heat, and all our three countries are the ones which experience high heat. They said that above 50-degree temperature, consistently high temperatures above 50 degrees make human body compromise the functionality. Maybe you can go out one day, you can rest the next day, you're too hot, you're dehydrated, you get over that. But if consistently the temperatures are going to be that high, it hits your health, it hits your productivity. Then we have vector borne diseases. I think Sri Lanka heard of dengue first. You are in a lower latitudes. Your weather was one which sort of gave birth to those vector-borne diseases. It traveled all the way up. India experiences, Pakistan experiences it in a higher latitudes because the heat has traveled up. So we need to understand there's science in it, but the way we communicate, we have street theater. It's a very popular South Asian medium. There's a great oral tradition in South Asia of storytelling, where people who are not educated, they are sitting in their village panchayats, and we call them otaks, or whatever, and they're sitting there and there's storytelling going on. And there, those who know, they need to tell the story in a manner that the audience is understanding it. They can have the elders talk about their indigenous knowledge or how they are seeing the changes coming in, and then explain to it in a manner that they can understand. So there are various ways that need to be used all at the same time. I'm not saying it's going to be a one after the other approach. I'll stop here.
Absolutely. It's not just about forest fires, flooding, you name it, an entire list. We've gone through it, and it's like we'll time and time again, you tell us what it is, we'll prepare ourselves for it. And that's how the game rolls. Apurva, you mentioned how, this whole collaboration with SARC and whatnot, big names that we have all around the world collaborating, that they have to play an important part. Just to continue with the whole cricket touch that we all love and bring on, we also look at players. We want change. We want them to change. We want them to bring the blood to the game. In the same way, we want these collaborative bodies also to bring about behavioral change. How are we achieving behavioral change? What is your aspect on it? What is holding people back from moving forward?
I think honestly, I believe people have different priorities, right? If somebody is not getting food, right? If somebody is, their whole focus is on reaching their offices on time, climate is not their, problem, even though it is directly affecting them, even though they acknowledge, okay, yes, the weather is changing, days are hotter, monsoon is erratic, all of those things they acknowledge. But still, I mean, to strike that conversation, I mean, people need to be made aware of how directly, climate change is impacting them. And I believe mainstream media, like Afia ma'am has already said, that influencers, I also believe this is a medium which needs to be explored, and more youth influencers we need, who are, talking about the impacts of climate change. Already, like in case of India, we have Indian celebrities who are traveling around the world, traveling around the country, and they are promoting or talking about ecotourism, like how a particular hotel is trying to cut down their plastics and how they are contributing to the environment conservation, etc. So more and more, I think conversation, more and more influencers we need, definitely. But then these influencers are not just going to come up, right? There needs to be some sort of, education given to people, to kids. So I believe one thing would be to educate kids from a very young age, like since the kindergarten, I would say, to make kids aware about the impact of climate change is one thing, so that by the time they are 18, they are adult, they are already aware about the detrimental impacts of climate change, the detrimental impacts of, say, using plastics, of throwing away garbage, or of not using the water, not conserving the water resources, so on and so forth. So these habits needs to be inculcated, and then automatically when when these kids are introduced in the society, I mean, they are going to, take this forward. And I would like to tell you about one case, which is, I mean, one petition which is filed by this girl called Ridhima Pandey, and it's ongoing under Supreme Court of India. So she filed this petition when she was 8, 9 year old. I mean, they call her the very young environment activist, and she filed this case in 2017. Now she is 70-year old, and already under that case, one directive has been given by the court, which is saying that the 8 ministries needs to work together to tackle climate change. And while we are at it, I also like to talk about the recent advisory opinion of ICJ, which has come up on ICJ. So that is also a result of activism, youth activism of the island country of Netanyahu. Vanuatu.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. So that is also result of that. So these, I mean, it's an organization of youth of that island, and they, ask their government to take this thing forward in the United Nations, and they, I mean, passed a resolution. I mean, they made sure that the General Assembly resolution is passed for the advisory opinion to the ICJ. So two questions they posed: that what are the state's obligations with regard to climate change, and what will be the legal consequences of those obligations. So I mean, it's a landmark, I would say, judgments or advisory opinion of ICJ, and they said that states are responsible to take action with regard to climate change under the climate change treaty. So you have UNFCCC, Paris Agreement, as well as other environmental treaties. So we have ozone depletion treaty, Montreal Protocol of 1987. So it's not just UNFCCC and Kyoto and Paris, but even other environmental treaties which are, what you call, stating the state's obligation to reduce carbon emissions. So, and the court has said that if the states do not take action to that respect, then there will be legal consequences. If they have a legal liability. Now, advisory opinion is not binding on states, but now, I mean, it has a very high, what you call, judicial value. These can be used in future cases. If that happens, that can be utilized by even domestic cases in each state, where people can ask their governments that what are the actions that you are taking. So under climate change regime, we have to, each state has to communicate its NDC, nationally determined contributions. And those, your policies should align with those NDCs, whether they are aligning or not, or whether those NDCs are enough to tackle climate change. So all of that now, I mean, we see more and more from the court side, I would say, whether it is ICJ or even domestic courts. In case of India, even, I mean, with regard to environment, there has been landmark cases where the Supreme Court has acknowledged fundamental rights of citizens with regard to their healthy environment, clean environment, sustainable development. And even in Sri Lanka, with regard to sustainable development, there are already cases. I mean, courts are taking that stand. But you see, all of these are result of some kind of activism, right? Or some, let's say, empowered and educated citizen who has taken that step and, done that. So the information, the rights of the people that they have, with regard to their clean environment, with regard to ask their government to take action for climate change, to tackle climate change, needs to be communicated. Now, government is not going to do it, right? Who is going to do it? So it has to be, I believe, civil society, which is going to, who should put forward these, conversations in schools at a very young age. I mean, if you ask me to talk to my father and convince him about something, it's going to be difficult. But if you tell me, talk to a primary student or a higher secondary student, I can tell them and they will understand. So I mean, we have to start young to educate these people, and yeah, and so on, and the youth and the young influencers. These need to be, I mean, some sort of incentives should be given to such influencers from the government side, probably. So whatever is lacking from the government side, private parties can do, not private parties, but these influencers can individually take that forward. Secondly, I believe this is something which is also missing from the political field. I mean, if you see in Western countries, even in Australia, you have political parties whose sole agenda is environment protection or climate change. India, we don't have any political party which is having environment or climate change as their agenda. Okay, it's completely missing. So, I mean, that needs to, and it's a very big issue. It is, like we have already discussed, affects not just the present, the future generations as well. So it is not just intra-generational aspect to climate change, but also inter generation aspect, right? So that needs to be communicated, that needs to come in the political sphere as well, so that it will lead to policy changes. I mean, everything has to be collaborating, and everything, it's not just one thing which is going to push this forward. It has to be, all the sectors, media, government, and private parties who should bring this who should take this forward. And yeah, I mean, it's not just, one sector or one set of people which is going to make change. We sitting here, we are already aware about it, but we have to go out there and, communicate the changes, and, just talk about even the policies at the regional level also, not just national level, regional level, state level also, to really, take this forward, to make people aware basically about this.
Thanks, Apurva. You brought some very interesting insights, which crosses me to Ranga to understand. Um, we have influencers. We mentioned governments. We mentioned key stakeholders, but I don't think people understand or see how the South Asian countries or the Asian countries do role in their matters when it comes to key stakeholders. According to you, beyond the scientists, beyond the policymakers, what do you see, or how do you sort of bring on a platform to understand the key stakeholders? Who should they be, and what roles should each one play? Because I noticed that media always delivers a message out. Whenever there is a crucial factor, they are the first to deliver it. But then there are instances where it can be sensitive, it can be out of the box, it can be, oh, this thing is happening. Ranga, how do you see this on the key stakeholders, and what active role should they play? And I'm extremely sorry, until I ask Ranga that question, I like to ask that from my audience as well. What's your thinking process? Who do you think should be actively involved? Now, please don't come back and by saying the president should be involved here. That doesn't work. But we're looking for real active people. Ranga, go for it.
It's the most difficult question anyone asked me in any of the forums, I would say. So I personally engaged in UNFCCC negotiations since 2008, continuously, up to date. I've attended almost all the COPs and represented as a civil society person and even a negotiator until today. This is one of the struggles that we do. Before I go into your question, I will say one of the general problem we have in climate change communication and overall process. This is my personal perspective, engaging in different stakeholders for so many years on climate change. It's almost 20 years for me. One is that most of our climate change work, the people who are engaging in the process, including the communicators, their approach is little confrontational rather than collaborative. Most of the communication happen is that confrontational, and they try to make somebody is as the person or a party who's responsible for this, and they should pay for it, and we need to blame them. And I see the blames coming up, but I don't see how to get an approach to get their collaboration. Of course, in the international negotiations, climate change, of course, I can understand the different the geopolitical interest and the country interest need to come into there. But within the countries and probably within the regions, the collaboration is quite weak, I would say. One of the biggest party who's been missing in this discussion is the private sector. And most of the time, what I've seen is that the people are blaming private sector. They're exploiting, they are doing this and they're doing that, and they're not doing anything. And we need to take the private sector out. Because this communication happens, they talk about climate, the private sector with the multilateral big the conglomerates in their head, but they forget you and me individually as also private sector, because we do consume, we do buy things from the market, and we spend money in the market, and we are also private sector. I'm saying this because if we want to bend the curve of entire climate change trajectory, we need a lot of investments. And so far, we've been fighting and asking the public finance from this. Public finance is not from our own budgets, but we are asking from the developed countries to give their public finance to the countries in the developing nations to do the bending this curve, the investments. I think it's justifiable. Of course, we have all the rights. But unfortunately, even if all the developed countries spend their 25% of their GDP in climate change actions in our countries, we might not be able to bend the curve. Because we get their money and we continue our own lifestyle as business as usual. Right? So we need investments need to come from the private sector. I think we need to bring this missing link into this. Private sector is not the big conglomerates I'm talking about. I'm talking about you, me, everyone who's interacting with the market, our consumption and production behaviors. From our side, from the small businesses, the micro businesses, from the large conglomerates, the corporates, whatnot. And we need to, because our investments are important to bend the curve. For example, let's think you're going to build a house. How you're going to build the house? Are you going to build a conventional house like others, buying the same material, buying the same things, and putting up a lot of air conditions? Or are you going to do it in climate resilient manner? And are you going to fit environmental friendly stuff in your home? You made the decision. Right? But to make that decision, things should be there out in the market. There should be carpenters, there should be the masons, there should be the suppliers, there should be architects who are knowledgeable and who should be able to support you to do that. So we need to change the market system to bring adequate finance to bend this curve. But unfortunately, most of our communication efforts are not targeting the private sector. Again, I'm saying private sector is not the large conglomerate I'm talking about, including you and me. I'm talking about the market. So without changing the market, we might not be able to get sufficient finance to bend this curve urgently as we need. So therefore, I think this collaborative communication to bring the market on board is quite important rather than being confrontational. Rather than addressing your entire question, how to bring all the actors together, of course, we can talk about platforms, we can talk about networks, of course, but I think number one is the market system. Because that will bring you, me, everybody on board. But changing market system is not an easy thing. Because the market system, we all know that it's profit-oriented. But in terms of climate change, we need to compromise that profit orientation a little towards the sustainability. Of course, there are issues with the current sustainability because it's been misused heavily as of now, but we need to bring it into the true nature. I'll stop there.
I love your answer, Ranga, because it actually brings in a very important area, because most of the time we see, we don't want to say private sector, but we bring it as a broad level, and how much they just pump in the money and then we forget about it. You're absolutely right. And then another crucial aspect would just come in, and then that's where we collaborate again. So there is no ongoing system, or even if you take an example, like you said, a house, if it's warm, we switch on the AC. If it's too cold, it's back to the heaters. So what's our solution? What's our way about with it? I want to ask Afia, just to understand, when we collaborate with these groups, does it bridge the gap between the science, the policyholders, and the people?
So I'm so happy that he brought this up, because you see the conversation earlier, like I said, about a decade and a half, it was all about science, climate change. And then, of course, the different, when it became more granular, so you could see the other stuff. in the Paris conference, the different streams that were identified. Yes, Paris was all about emissions cuts, right? And of course, India, the responsibility of each nation of their contributions, like Purva mentioned, NDCs, nationally determined contributions. But there was another stream which I have been harping on for a long time, and I found very few takers, except now I can see that Titanic is turning, and that is of NMM, which was New Market Mechanisms. Ranga, you must remember it if you were there. So NMM was talking about the engagement with the private sector for two reasons. One was because we do need the cleaning up of their processes. The private sector was seen as profiting off the earth or the resources to the detriment of the earth. So, for one thing, they needed, the processes need to be cleaned up. And the other is that, as I very rightly mentioned, public finance was never ever going to fill that gap. So this was the call to unlock the finance which the private sector contained within it by it becoming less damaging. So obviously, first they had to invest in themselves. And you have seen the concept of circularity come out of that. You've seen the slow growth, but it's started of ESG, environment, social governance. These concepts are there, which have moved beyond just mere CSR, that you hand out something to somebody, oh, we'll do something for this community and let's just sponsor that tournament or put up a school or a hospital, something. It's becoming more holistic. It is becoming more in sync with the kind of business they do. Earlier, we never, and because climate change is all about behavior change within the society as well, we never heard of fast fashion earlier. Now, the manufacturers themselves are going into repurposing whatever is left over instead of throwing it into landfills. So, there are examples. There should have been a lot more. And similarly, as and when the people are understanding, the civil society push is also there. So I think, how do you bridge? I see the communicators as a bridge, and the other segment of population that I see as a bridge are the teachers. Apurva very rightly mentioned that, the students right from the beginning need to know about these things. So when they grow up, for one thing, their lifestyle change should be the kind which is in sync, more in sync with nature, less damaging, because it's a consumptive, it's actually the consumptive, or rather the greed, that basically is the actual trigger of climate change. But also, when they go and sit in decision making places, they have to sign off on some policies which puts in place safeguards, which puts nature first, which puts nature based solutions first. So that is how, that change will come. Now again, we need to accelerate. We cannot sort of go on a very long winded path. Leapfrogging is the way. You have seen technology leapfrogging progress. So similarly, we need to understand these things, and maybe there will be a technical fix which helps us stay close to nature, and not, something you see in these sci-fi movies, which don't really have that connect to nature. But the teachers, as well as the communicators, they could be journalists, they could be singers, they could be writers, they could be poets, they could be artists. So we have those fraternities here who we have been engaging with, and we have seen the difference, because they each have their own audience. An artist will not have a scientific person, as his audience, but the scientists will not have the artist fraternity as their audience. So at some space, the communicators have to bridge that gap, use the science in an easily understandable manner and communicate to the artist, and then the artist then take it forward there. Similarly, if we have champions in cricket, you can't teach them the science of climate change. You have to just show them the impact it has and the importance that their face or their personality has on actually billions. Billions is a figure we throw out very easily, but literally within our region, there are billions of people who actually are riveted to what they are doing, what's happening on the cricket field. You mentioned aviation. I used to be an air traffic controller once in my past life. So that conversation is happening there for two reasons. Again, it's they are looking at what's in it for me. So beyond the jet streams changing because of the climatic changes, they are looking at the hydrogen fuel, which is going to be with the shift away from fossil fuel. They have to fly the planes on some fuel. So now they are looking at researching how hydrogen fuel, and we've already had one test flight around the globe. So that is how progress takes place in these different sectors. And I do totally agree that we need to somehow find that trigger where the snowball grows fast, because the champions are there. There are sectors which are identified, so we know who the stakeholders are. We just have to sort of be fast about it, because a triple planetary crisis is actually leading us to a neverland. So we need to be cognizant of that.
Thanks, Avia. I think I didn't realize that I've sulked into this conversation so much that the time has
Oh,
just flown out of nowhere. Not that I'm cutting short the webinar, because I know it has been so interesting that we've been going on and on. But let's move on to the nitty-gritty so that we don't drag and keep our audiences for a very long time. And also just to remind everyone that it has been recorded, but we would love for you to stay. And thank you for the comments that were shared so far. It's good to know what your companies are doing. It's good to know how much you are engaging and your thought process as well. But let me cross over to Apurva. You said teachers, you said people need to be engaged, but do you think that there is a gap between the science of understanding or the knowledge, the scientific knowledge, and how it is communicated to the audience? Isn't that a big matter to the general public, especially when we have to create awareness to them?
Absolutely. See, it is very difficult to make layman understand the technical or the scientific information about climate change. Like if I talk about international law or the principles like CBDR, RC, and all that, it's very difficult to explain that to a layman, especially if that audience is younger, and that depends on the level of education also. So I think again, this is a prerogative of a teacher or the communicator to break it down into simpler language, right? To bring it down to their level and communicate, because the issue is such that it is not something which is rocket science to anybody. Everybody connects to it, everybody understands. Its only thing is how the language, how we communicate to it. So definitely, I mean, there is a gap there, I mean, which needs to be bridged, but I don't believe that it is going to be very difficult. uh, I mean, already we have such conversation where we are talking about conservation of environment and this and that. People are already talking about it, but it is not a priority. Like the urgency of it needs to be emphasized, right? And when we do that, I think we can very easily bridge that gap. But the thing is, uh, conversation about climate change needs to come in the mainstream media. Like every day, I believe news channels, at least five news should be there for people to read, what is happening, how the weather is changing, how is climate change impacting, people's everyday life. And it is happening. It's not that it is not happening. I mean, like, for example, in summer in India, you'll see that, okay, the temperature are, has broken last 2 years records. Northwestern, I mean, summers in India and even Pakistan until now, it's so hot. And then when the monsoon comes, it's erratic, right? And when the winters, it's extreme cold sometimes, or it is not cold enough. So, I mean, these things are all, and these are impacting your crops, agriculture. So, I mean, people like, for example, in South Asia and India, and of course in Pakistan also, we enjoy our mangoes very much. Now, there are so many varieties which are available in summer of these mangoes. So many varieties of these mangoes are, not what do you call, I wouldn't say becoming extinct, but it's not as it used to be. The produce is reducing, or it is not, certain varieties are not coming altogether. So these are small things, which impacts people's everyday life. Like you have memories, you connect summer with a certain thing, and similarly with winters. So I mean, each and every aspect of your life, even the smallest of things, is impacted. Only thing is you need to connect that, the everyday life, with the climate change, with the weather change. All of that needs to be, and I believe people will. I mean, I don't think people are not very disconnected from this topic.
Absolutely, Apurva. Thank you for sharing us that. And also, I think we all had in our childhood teachers encouraging us about the limitations, what goes through, what are you doing? Switch off that light, blah, blah, blah. And then it moves on households. How do we live in our house? And then sometimes we keep the television running for hours and hours, and that also is the little nitty-gritties that's being collected. And now, speaking of how we communicate, I know that time is the essence, so I'm going to keep it absolutely short in my questions, also without dragging examples and cricket and whatnot. And I would like to request my panelists also to give your best possible answers in the shortest possible manner. And let me start with Afia. Why do you think climate messages often fail to connect with the public?
I think it only fails when the jargon is used too much. Like Apurva said, it has to be made easy to understand. I'm not saying dumb down the message, but make it relatable, make it relevant to their life. You speak in a different manner to a farmer than you would to a mariner. We can talk about ocean pollution impacting their ships, the corrosion in the harbor. That is not something that the farmer would be interested in. You talk to in a different manner to the people living on the coast than you would into the glacial north. So the communicate the trick, this is why I called it, there's a science of communication where you get all the information, and then there's the art of communicating on how you find which audience will receive it how. And that is why I also mentioned, because it's not, I wished it was like that. I know in Sri Lanka it is that you do have 100% literacy, but Pakistan doesn't. And this is why I kept emphasizing on these other means of communication. We have a lot of children who do not have access to schools, and also those who do, their teachers do not have access on how to communicate. So it's, we have to keep taking those steps back. There have to be teachers training. There has to be a kind of curriculum which goes beyond just the environmental sciences subject or the science subject or geography subject. And if you're teaching them languages, you're teaching them anything else, the computers, then it has to be focused that, okay, in language, why don't you write an essay about the changing climate, things like that, because it's difficult to contain it earlier in some of the schools. I know there are private schools which are taking a lot of it because they have more money, they have more means to invest in newer things in the curriculum. But the whole point is that the majority, the public domain, the public sector does not have those finances. And for people out of school, then we use these methods. There are religious schools, so this entire region again is very religious. We are invested in all the different religions, so we engage with a religious fraternity, that this is how you communicate these messages. These are all within your, all religions teach the same thing. All religions teach us environmental stewardship. You communicate it in your words, how it is taught in your religion, use it for that. And then, like I said, we have street theaters, we have songs, we have poetry. There are so many poetries that are written around rivers and how to take care of them, and considering river as your mother, the life giver. So there are different streams of communication, and I think we need to develop all of them on a parallel level, because they address all different. Otherwise, if we have just one stream of communication, we will sort of ignore a very large fraternity which will not know what we are talking about at all. I'll stop.
Ranga, how do we tell a story? How do we motivate someone? How should we drive?
I'm not a communication specialist, but I'm repeating one of the messages that I mentioned earlier. It need to be collaborative rather than confrontational. I find most of the climate change communications, if you read any article or a story or whatever, most of the time it's confrontational, and there's a kind of a victim, and there's somebody who needs to be responsible for that. I think we need to appreciate that in whatever means, most of the stakeholders, most of people, most of the governments, most of the institutions are taking actions, even though those are not very significant or probably not in par of what our expectations or what we need. But I think the collaboration is something very important, because climate change is not something we can solve with a single party or a kind of a limited parties. Everyone needs to come on board. So it's important that we bring on board all the parties. So we need to be very collaborative. There are ways and means of sorting out things and working together towards a common goal. So that understanding that common ground is very important. So I think that's the important thing. Of course, I think both Apurva and Afia mentioned there are so many options available in terms of the communicating and giving stories to different stakeholders. I think I'm of course agreeing with all of these things, but let's try to be more collaborative. So that's my request and my opinion.
Apurva, practical approaches instead of coming out with an urgency and a threat. How do we go about?
I think again, see, we have already talked about it. It's missing from the mainstream media, right? So I don't know how we can actually bring that. How can we, ask these huge media houses to really talk about it? But like Afia has said, influencers, these young influencers, these small podcasts which are there. So because the youth is connecting to such influencers. I am most active on my Instagram, and so is everybody around me. We are watching those reels or those shorts on Facebook and TikTok. We don't have TikTok in India, but most people do. So those things, I think I would say would be the fastest means to really reach out to maximum people. And yeah, and just breaking down those difficult or those technical information, like for example, advisory opinion of ICJ. So I've seen some influencers who are telling about it in a very short, in those short videos, in a very simple manner. So that is very innovative. I think more and more, and that again, collaboration is needed. So somebody who knows the technical knowledge and somebody who has that art maybe needs to collaborate, and that way. So I think yes, that more and more that is the way forward.
All right. In closing, just to understand, we've spoken on different topics of how do we tell a story, what's our strategy, where have we gone wrong, how do we drive and understand people in what we are sharing. If I ask my three panelists in one sentence, if you could give one piece of advice to the communicators, the policymakers, the activists, people who are very keen and engaging on making climate communication more impactful, what would it be? And who would like to start?
I'll take the floor.
Go for it.
One thing is that the communicators need to understand that climate change, whatever the actions on climate change, should be transformational. We are trying to change a whole system. You can't do it overnight. And if you have that transformational view, I think then it's the communication is going to be more effective. So small steps are important, and it should be collaborative, and it should be kind of a whole system-wide view is important in the communications. I made it very short. Sorry.
Afia?
So I would, at the risk of repeating myself, I think we need to make everything relatable to whichever segment of people you're talking to. That's the only way, they will be able to listen. Otherwise, you shut off if there's something very that goes above your head. To use a cricketing term again in the closing, if somebody is throwing a bouncer at you, you either duck or you leave it. But to be able to play the stroke, you need to be able to play, to be able to look at the bowler. They have to deliver that ball to you. And that's what the communicators need to learn. Make it relatable.
Apurva?
Yeah, so I would also be repeating, like already previous speakers have already said enough, and same thing. So, speaking in the local language,
Yes.
connecting it with the local context and the current, events, I think that is the way forward to effectively communicate, the climate change urgency or the crisis or, yeah, the steps, whatever.
Great stuff. Thank you. And I haven't forgotten my audience, so I would like to ask you, and I would like to just take two questions if there is. And thank you for joining us and staying right throughout. Anamika has been very engaging from the start till the end, chatting with us, sharing insights. But we like to ask questions from the audience, just two. If it's possible, feel free to throw in your question on the chat, or I'll be
Sure.
happy read it out to you.
Ma'am, may I ask one question?
Go for it, Dr. Ravi.
Yep. Just ma'am, for example, in India, government has mentioned one slogan, Desh Bachao Beti Padhao. So we can develop such type of slogan, Climate Bachao Desh Badhao, like this slogan for the target audience.
Apurva, what do you think about it?
Yeah, I think it's actually a good idea. These slogans are very catchy. People remember that and people associate with the policy, right? So this one, Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao is like if you educate the girl child, you are what do you call furthering your family and family's achievement and this and that. So and that was targeted at the female infanticide and all those things, female education. So I mean, such slogans are definitely catchy. I mean. And they will be effective, I'm sure. Yes, I agree to that suggestion.
Thank you, Dr. Ravi. Anyone else? No, we're all quiet.
I think we
We've
wore them
met
out.
them enough. All right. Thank you very much to everyone for joining us on our session today. And special thanks to Mr. Ranga Pallivala, Ms. Afia Salam, and Ms. Apurva Pathak for joining us and taking your time and sharing us that in-depth knowledge and inspiring us with all those points that you've shared. Thank you to all those who joined us online as well. We understand that Climate Change Communication Hub is committed to turning climate change awareness into action by strengthening how we connect, how we communicate, and we collaborate. And as much as we spoke on, bringing out our little confrontational arguments, we're happy to collaborate in the future and take it forward with positivity, ensuring that we bring about the right message to our audiences so that we save the planet in the right way. So until we join you next time, stay safe, stay inspired, and keep the change. Yes, we shall see you soon.